Good evening, it's February 6th. A warm welcome to the people in the audience and a warm welcome to those people who are watching this conversation from their mobile homes, their hotel rooms or their kitchens. Welcome. Usually we start with a conversation, but today, and this evening is all about Bonnie Honig, we have a special introduction, and this will be delivered to you by Bastiaan Rijpkema. Most people in the Netherlands know Mr. Rijpkema, but for those who don't know him yet, I think about maybe 2,000 people, I'll introduce you to him. I introduce him to you. Mr. Rijpkema, born in 1987, is professor, and correct me if I make mistakes, Bastiaan, is professor of legal philosophy at the University of Leiden. He wrote a dissertation about resilient democracy, for which he received the Princess Boeken Prize in 2016. In 2020, he published his book Lokale Weerbare Democratie, Local Resilient Democracy, and in addition to his scientific work, he writes columns and articles for NRC, a Dutch newspaper, and De Groene Amsterdammer, a Dutch weekly. Bastiaan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Arnon. This is an era of shock politics. In her book, Shell-Shocked, Bonnie Honig describes shock politics as the defining feature of the first Trump administration. At its core, shock politics is a bombardment of, I quote, noise and accusations every day at every minute, resulting in disorientation of the public, dissatisfaction and civic fatigue. The first weeks of the second Trump administration were no different. To the contrary, a president, it should be noted, that got re-elected after the January 6 attack on the Capitol, the heart of America's democracy. Other countries have followed their own distinct paths to democratic erosion. According to the VDEM Institute, the level of democracy experienced by the average person worldwide is now down to the level of 1985, with only 32 liberal democracies left. Autocratization, VDEM says in their report, not democratization, is the dominant trend in the world. Where can Democrats find resources to counter autocratization? I think many of these resources can be found in the work of Bonnie Honig. Her work on democratic theory spans more than 3 decades and has inspired democratic thought across the world. Tomorrow she will receive an honorary doctorate from Leiden University for her significant contributions to democratic thinking. In this introduction, my aim is to show, briefly, that it's precisely Honig's work that our thinking about democratic resistance needs now. My talk is based on the lengthier treatment that can be found in my introduction to the Dutch edition of Honig's Public Things that we launch here tonight, Publieke Dingen. At first sight, a recourse to Honig might seem odd. Honig is one of the foundational thinkers of what is called agonistic democracy. Agonism stresses the need for political struggle, not consensus. It emphasizes the permanent challenge to political systems, to do justice to the remainders of politics. Honig argues against the closing of political space. Her seminal book, Political Theory, has famously shown how intolerance also creeps into very liberal democratic political theories, such as John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. Political theory came out in the early 90s. Now we are confronted with a politics that not even tries to, or even pretends to be, tolerant or liberal democratic. The Dutch Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders, a coalition partner in the Netherlands, is a prime example. The intolerance is right there. It's in its election program. According to the Party for Freedom, all mosques and Islamic schools should be closed, without exception. A clear violation of core constitutional rights to freedom of religion and non-discrimination. No subtle challenge here, no intolerances that are in need of detection. This difference in the predicament for democracy today is of course also noted by Honig herself. A few years ago, Honig described how, and I quote, back in the early 1990s, political theory was addressed to a more achievable task than what democracy is confronted with today. But also when pitted against the more formidable challenge of opposing autocratization, Honig's thinking and agonism can offer guidance. I will mention 3 such points of guidance that Honig's work can offer. First, Honig's thinking provides an important corrective to overemphasizing institutions and procedures in the defense of democracy. For the Arendtian, Honig, democracy primarily is collective action, acting in concert for a common goal. The defense of democracy happens everywhere. It's not tied to democracy's most obvious institutions, such as elections or parliaments. Democratic action can be protest, it can be collective legal action, it can be starting an NGO, or it can be constitutional education. Second, Honig's work can offer somewhat of a reconciliation with the task that lies ahead. It's easy to feel stunned or worn out when core constitutional rights, once deemed unchallengeable, come under fire. Already in political theory, Honig argues that such is only to be expected. Law cannot make an end to political struggle. Constitutional rights will be contested again and again. And therefore, they ask for our continuous defense. A defense by collective democratic action inside and outside political institutions. We should learn, Honig contends, and I quote, to treat rights and law as a part of political contest rather than the instruments of its closure. Honig thus broadens our perspective of where the sides and actors of democratic defense can be found. And her thinking can reconcile us with the fact that indeed democracy will need to be defended politically again and again. But where to start? Think of the United States, with shock politics already operating at a now blistering speed, not ruling out economic or military force to take control of Greenland, insisting that Canada could or should become the 51st state of America, threatening allies with trade tariffs, saying US aid is run by a bunch of radical lunatics, the instant freezing of federal funding, the ensuing legal battles. It's only February. Where does democratic resistance start? This is the third insight in democratic resistance that Honig offers. Stunned by the disorientation of shock politics, Honig contends citizens need orientation. And this is where public things come in. In her book, Public Things, of which we launched the Dutch edition today, Honig shows a new way to look at democracy. Honig gives center stage to our public things. Instead of focusing on citizens and or procedures, important as they are, of course, Honig asks us to pay attention to the substance of democracy, the stuff of democracy, the things we contest with others, the things we have conflicts about, and the things we come together for, the public things. Our libraries, public schools, the healthcare system, social security, airport security, sewage systems, drinking water, and much more. They form the contents of our democratic deliberations. This is their special value, not only in the goods they deliver. Public things jumpstart democratic collective action. First there is a public thing, Honig would say, or a public concern, and then citizens cluster around them and are called into democratic action. And this is where their value for democratic self-defense lies. In short, Honig's public things help democratic defense through orientation, attachment, and activation. They orient and position democratic defense amid a constant flow of disruption. They point to the concrete things that need our defending, from public education to foreign aid. Public things also provide attachment. They make that people care for their public things and their democracy. And through this attachment, public things activate citizens, even when we don't expect it. Honig's example of, I quote, "everybody loves Big Bird," is as funny as it is striking. Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney jokingly attacked Sesame Street, Big Bird, the bird we know as Pino, back in 2012, as a symbol of useless spending on public television. So, attack on Big Bird for the useless spending of public television. The surprise was it backfired. People came to the defense of their public thing, attached as they were to Big Bird and to their public broadcasting service. Everybody loves Big Bird. Might public things, in a similar vein, activate citizens into a defense of their democracy? Honig once called the constitutional patriotism of Jürgen Habermas, the love for one's constitution, Honig called, and I quote, "about as attractive as kissing a typewriter." We need something more. Our constitutional rights need more, and democratic resistance needs more. In conclusion, this is what the defense of democracy can learn from Honig's work. Democratic resistance needs politics. It needs collective action, and it very much needs the public things that make up the life of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bastiaan, for this delightful and enlightening introduction. And thank you also for bringing up the beautiful quote about Jürgen Habermas. I think his Verfassungspatriotismus is death, especially after what you said about it. Okay, what we are going to do, and those of you who have been here before know this, I will talk with Balie for about 60, 70, 80 minutes, depending on how uplifting the conversation is. And after that, you can ask questions. Veronica will walk around with a mic. And when it comes to questions, I'm a bit harsh. No anecdotes, no opinions, no statements about current affairs, just a question. And please, no more than 2 vulgarities per question. That's all. We will focus, Balie, first of all, of course, on public things, because this is the launch of the Dutch edition of the book. And hopefully there's time enough to talk a bit also about, it was already mentioned by Bastiaan, about your book, Political Theory. I'd like to walk through the book a bit, based on some quotes. I'd like to start with a quote in the introduction. There you write, the idea is to follow what I take to be Arendt's, Hannah Arendt's and Donald Winnicott's leads in order to think about democratic theory in the context of object relations and to ask whether democracy might be constitutively dependent on public, emphasis on public things. So my first question would consist of 2 questions basically. What else would democracy be dependent on? And how maximalist is your approach? Of course, there's the minimalist approach to a democracy, to a state, saying that all we need is police and army in order to protect us for burglars, so that we don't have to kill the burglar ourselves, we can call the police. And there's the maximalist approach. So let me phrase it differently. Would you say that most politicians in the US, even from the Democratic Party, would call you a commie, would call you a communist? How far to the left are you from, let's say, Bernie Sanders?
So that's the second question. Maybe I start with the first one.
I sneaked in a third. Let's start, yeah.
So first of all, I'll just say very quickly thank you to Bastiaan and also to for making time to be here and for engaging my work with such seriousness. I don't think in terms of left and right, except in some extreme circumstances. So I wouldn't really know for sure. I think on some things I might be a little bit more in the middle, and some things perhaps a little left, on almost nothing, right? But I don't think that way, partly because there is a tendency in the US to binarize everything from sex, gender to politics and everything in between. And I think most of what's important and interesting in the human experience is in the in-betweens and not in these poles. So I can't answer the question that way, but But maybe we can talk for a minute about not Big Bird, but what Winnicott calls the transitional object, just to explain a little bit about what the term object relations is doing in this question. Is that
That's fine.
good? So
maybe I think not too many people, or there might be people in the audience who don't know who's Winnicott.
Right.
So maybe you can introduce Winnicott as well.
Sure. It's been a while, but it's D.W. Winnicott, and he was a child psychologist writing in the mid-century, 40s, 50s, 60s. And if you ever read any of his work, you're for sure going to think, I wish he was my therapist, because he seems absolutely perfectly pitched around every problem. Of course, he's writing it. But it's a very humanistic account of the ways in which we move through transitions in various life stages, and the kinds of disorders that psychiatrists and psychologists encounter are usually some sort of blocked transition or difficulty in transition of some kind, and a failure to understand what's going on with the transition for the child. One of the things that's most interesting about Winnicott is he talks about what we need to get through these different transitions, something called a holding environment. But he also says, even though he's talking about children's stages of development, he also says that we all continually go through these stages of development through all of our lives. So just because you got through it once doesn't mean you'll miss having to go through a transition again to a different stage of maturity later. So Winnicott is very well known for being an object relation, from the object relations school. There are other members as well. But what I really liked in Winnicott's work, and that resonated for me in the work of Hannah Arendt, is this idea that things stabilize the world for us when we are feeling very unstable. So moments of transition from one stage of maturity to the next. And my favorite example of his, probably because both my own offspring had these, are the blanket that a young child has. The dirtier and the smellier, the better it is, because it holds the history, the corporeal history of the child and its environment. And if you've ever been around a child who has one of these, it's sort of an instant comfort almost when they reach for the blanket. So this is an example of how this object, which is not the mother, not the father, not anyone who's loved, but a thing, creates a kind of stability for a child in crisis. And I extend that idea to the way that Hannah Arendt talks about the way that humans build things, shared things, houses, monuments, hospitals, sewage treatment centers, prisons, all kinds of things that create a lasting world without which we would still be living in nature, she says. So she doesn't sound like the greenest political theorist in this moment of her work, but I think she's saying something very important, which is a lasting world that carries shared memory is an important part of being part of a political life, being in a polity with others. And so even though she seems to separate fabrication and work from what we do in politics, at the same time, it's very much a necessary condition that we have museums and sculptures and art that remind us of who we were and of who we want to be in the future. One way to think about those things is as moving away from children to thinking about citizens as requiring points of stabilization, especially at moments of crisis or transition internal to a polity. And it's hard to do that because we fight about them. So, we fight about these objects that supposedly give us stability, which seems to make them not able to give us stability.
What do you mean exactly by we fight? Is this what you refer to what Winnicott also said, that the toddler needs to destroy the object?
Yes.
Is this what you mean by we fight?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's comparable, right? So the interesting thing about the child who loves their blanket is that they don't keep it under a glass case where it will be safe.
Quite
They throw it down the stairs, they track it through the mud, and they trust that it will survive their aggression. And that's what's so important about the blanket is it does survive their aggression. It's tattered and smelly, but it still exists usually.
Usually.
So this is a kind of world-stabilizing thing that the child can safely express all of its anger and aggression and hostility, and the object survives. Why is that important? Not just because it's important to the child, but the child learns about what Winnicott calls object permanence, that you can have these terrible feelings and the world will survive your rage. And this is something we all need to know, right? That the world will survive our rage. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to express such feelings, and then other kinds of bad things happen. Arendt also talks about, not with the psycho language of object permanence, but she talks in a regular way about the permanence of objects, that they survive us, and that we experience ourselves more as passing through their world than them sort of passing through our world, because they mostly exist over a lifetime.
Can we conclude that, for example, for New Yorkers, Central Park is their dirty blanket?
Yes.
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 Okay. You didn't answer the question about what the other things we need in order to have a stable democracy. How far should this public realm go? What else? Should we nationalize factories?
So one thing that's important to me in the book is that, and now I realize why you were asking me about right and left, because that was the question.
I'm not. No, that's
okay.
It was, I said about Bernie Sanders a bit in jest.
One thing that's important to me in the book is not to call public things collectively owned things. In other words, especially in the U.S., many public things are not publicly owned. Many of them are public-private partnerships, they love to call it. Some are privately owned, but allowed to be owned by a private person because they've agreed to let it be used by a public for a certain number of years. That was the case with Zuccotti Park, which was occupied by the Occupy movement in 2010.
Mentioned also in your book.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was important because they were allowed to use policing differently from how a public space would have been policed at the time. I'm not sure there's that much of a difference anymore. So they're public if they either, not necessarily all of the above, are publicly funded, serve a public purpose, or have become habituated people to thinking about them as public, and so magnetize them into community in some way. And Central Park is definitely one of the examples, but one of the things I wanted to do in the book is not just pick the easy examples. So I have a friend who works in politics doing fundraising, and he says, everybody loves gardens. Everybody wants to donate to make a garden.
That's why you pick public phones.
Exactly. So there have to be some things in a public world that is stable that are not just the gardens, and they are things that sometimes fall into disuse, but when you need them, they're still there. And this is what I say about the public phone booths in the context of Hurricane Sandy. When all the cell towers went down, no one could call anyone to say they were okay. And then some guy thought, I wonder if that phone booth phone still works, because it was sitting there for 20 years. Nobody went in it. It was dirty. It was a mess. And he went in and put, I don't know how he had coins, but he had coins, and it worked. And then there were a line formed up the street in the middle of this weather catastrophe, climate catastrophe, of people who had survived the worst and wanted to let other people know that they were still around. I think that's such a great example of a public thing, actually.
Yeah, you're right about it. That these phones, these public phone booths, they cease to exist a bit. They're still there, but not anymore. But that they are hidden in plain sight, and you make a reference to another phrase by Donald Winnicott, the good enough mother.
Yes.
The good enough. We might talk about it a bit later. You used already the word crisis. I'd like to present you another quote from your book, also from the introduction. Without such public things, you write, democracy is reduced to procedures, polling and policing, all necessary perhaps, but certainly not sufficient conditions of democratic life. If we leave to democracy merely the practice of electoral majoritarianism and deliberative proceduralism, while divesting democratic states or publics of their ownership of or responsibility for public things, we risk reducing democratic citizenship to repetitive private work, what Lars von Trier, I hope I pronounced the name rightly, calls crisis ordinary, and exceptional public emergencies, what we can call crisis extraordinary. So basically what you are saying here, with help of Lars von Trier, is that the state of emergency, and now we're not far from Carl Schmitt, is already there. Maybe it's not named that way, but if the crisis extraordinary and the crisis ordinary are just all we have, how far, what's the difference with the real state of emergency?
Yeah, it's a good question. But maybe not my most beautiful sentence, though, that you read. It was long.
That's a long sentence. Okay, but you're not a novelist. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's not. I'm a novelist. Okay, look, maybe you write a novel. That's in the future.
The person that you're quoting who uses the term crisis ordinary, their name is Lauren Berlant. They died a couple of years ago, too young. And I think the reason that I mentioned that it's their term is I was distancing myself a little bit from it so that I'm not someone who enters into the crisis as our ordinary. In fact, I'm working now on a book about the ordinary, as something that sustains itself and is a little bit resistant to crisis. So I'm hoping that I'm not a Schmittian in that moment, and that I'm thinking about what would happen if we lived in a world without public things. Then we would perhaps be in such a world. But I believe that we are not in such a world yet, or at least in 2017, when I first published this book in English, I believe that we were not in that world yet. And that was because I felt that there were still points of orientation that are shared. That's the other thing. They can be shared without being public in the governmental sense, but still shared points of orientation. We could talk about, just this example that was brought up. Big Bird is an example of something that everybody knows, everyone has some kind of affective attachment to. And, it's not because it's paid for by a public, although it's partly that, but it's mostly a kind of, a childhood memory that we share because it's on television and so many people watch it when they're young. And it's been around for over 30 years, that one character. So I think I lost track of your question. Tell me again.
The question, the question was how far, if there are just different types of crisis we are in, how far and what's the difference with the real state of emergency and how needed? What do we get? That's now what I would ask the question also. Maybe we get something in return. Maybe the crisis gives us something. Maybe there's this famous phrase by Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, you might know it about, that capitalism is all about creative destruction. And destruction might be like needed. And where destruction is, the crisis is not far away.
So it's hard for me to agree with that. I wouldn't disagree with it as a critical account of capitalism necessarily, but it's hard for me to embrace such a view as creative destruction is necessary in this moment because there's a political party in the US that is, committed to this view.
I'm not saying I'm embracing that, by the way.
I know. I'm not imputing anything, but I'm saying this view is antithetical to the things that I want to promote through democratic theory, feminist theory, and the rest of the work that I do. In other words, to find points of stabilization, not because they're stable, like there are other things that are stable, like the patriarchal family structure. So not all things that are stable are good, but to find points of orientation around which greater equality and plurality can be organized, implanted. And so I don't do work in what's called normative theory, where we sort of, imagine what would be the best way to get equality and then make an argument for it. I'm more of a critical theorist, which means that I look at what we have and I try to find the points of possibility that are there. So in the context of an American political order that was very committed, still is, to privatization and neoliberalization, it becomes important to highlight how even those kinds of things depend on the stability of public things. And so maybe there's an opportunity in the appreciation of their power and their magnetism to resurrect this idea that was maybe more of a 19th century idea in the US. So this is really the thought experiment, and then then the idea is to say, if you live in a democracy and you think that what makes you a democracy is that you have elections and that most citizens have rights, and as you quoted, if it's about polling and policies and policing and procedures, and there are no other public things, what keeps us there? What are we talking about every day? And how are we connecting to each other? And how do we survive the moments of catastrophe and crisis that visit all human lives? And I think the answer is that without a place for public things as kind of the sources of object permanence, specifically for a democratic society, we would fall short. And then if you look at most democracies, of course, there are monuments everywhere for their for their collective power, right?
Or their collective victims.
And sometimes, yes, for their collective victims, yes.
To get a bit better hold of this public thing, I mean, Big Bird was mentioned by Bastiaan, you mentioned again, but wouldn't you say that, for example, if this is what's a public thing, that we could call Harry Potter also a public thing, or that's
not anymore?
Not anymore. Or a Hollywood star. What exactly is the distinction? Where does this public thing become a private thing?
I'm trying to think of examples of public things that have become private things. The American space program was a public thing. It was put into, it was initiated and then supported by the John F. Kennedy presidency and came to fruition 9 years later, several years after he died. This was a source of great pride in American ingenuity, engineering, science. And now it's a kind of dispersed relic of its former self, from what I read in the newspapers. I have no inside information. And of course, it has competitors. Both Bezos and Musk have been shooting rockets into the air privately. So this is...
You can buy a ticket now.
You can now buy a ticket.
Yes.
I don't, I personally wouldn't
recommend it.
No. But it's a different kind of it has lost the charm of the public thing to make people feel like they are part of something larger than themselves. And of course, Hannah Arendt, for example, was not very moved by the space project at the time, because she thought that the idea that you could escape the planet, she said back then in a very unpopular sort of a way, was bad for the human condition, because it meant that you didn't experience your place on Earth as all there was, and you needed to have a sense of that finitude, that this is all there is, from which follows care for the earth, mutuality, solidarity, a sense of going on together. And this exit option, betrays all of that, she said, that it would come to.
Interesting.
And she was right.
For somebody who herself was a refugee.
Yes.
She could have been a bit more respect for the escape artist.
I think the escape artist she had a lot of respect for, but not for the opt-out, which is the neoliberal way of sort of exiting the shared thing and having just one of your own. Yeah.
Before we go back to history and Tocqueville, because you mentioned already something about the history of the US, privatization and neoliberalism, these are words that you use quite often in the book, also without defining neoliberalism. And of course, it was a bit different in 2017, but now in 2025, most people, even the right-wing government, as far as I know, in the Netherlands, the VVD, the Liberal Conservative Party, was during the last elections, came out against neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. So I don't know any people anymore who say, oh, neoliberalism is good. So isn't it a bit too easy of a scapegoat to say it's all because of neoliberalism that we are in this predicament? Isn't it, I mean, nobody is offended when you blame neoliberalism for our problems.
No one's ever told me before that I'm not offensive enough.
That's my job to tell you this. Yeah, exactly.
I should be more offensive.
Please.
Neoliberalism was for a long time a very big word for a very unruly set of things. If you didn't like it, you called it neoliberalism, and it was sort of a more emotion word than a descriptive word. I did finally, thank you, I did finally use it in this book. I don't think I had used it before. And I used it in this book because I take it to be the name of a certain kind of characteristic, which is to prefer the private whenever possible, to opt out of the shared good or shared practice whenever possible. Once upon a time we might have called that selfishness or self-seeking, but because it's part of a culture, I felt it's not an individual psychological thing anymore. It's a kind of habit of thinking that is quite prevalent, at least in the US where I live. So that is why I use the word. And I should say, because I'm noticing that your questions are often so far about definitions. And so I don't do definition because I have a different relationship to theory. Some people do. Some people will define the terms and then they'll get in trouble for the definition. And I am a little bit more trained in the philosophy of language of Ludwig Wittgenstein, where you sort of create a world of terms that have a kind of family resemblance and you conjure the way of life out of them. So I'm not sure whether or not I tried to define neoliberalism at any point in the book, but it isn't my habit to give a definition to the term as much as to find its web of relations and then to tell stories and note places where it's used, and then from that nest of things conjure its meaning and, more importantly, its power, how it might be shaping our thinking, giving us a sense of what the choices are and what they aren't, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you mentioned Wittgenstein also in the beginning of your book, and I would say it's also it's since I love the escape artist, living by not defining things is also a beautiful way of escaping. Alexis de Tocqueville, you quote him. You said there was this longing for equality always, especially among Americans, and then you say, you let Tocqueville say, they see it close enough to know its charms, but they do not get near enough to enjoy it, this equality. And they will be dead before they have fully relished its delights. That's the reason for the strange melancholy often haunting inhabitants of democracies in the midst of abundance, and of the disgust with life sometimes gripping them in calm and easy circumstances. This quote I felt very attracted to. I think it's a beautiful, not that I don't feel attracted to the things you write, not at all, also, but there's this beautiful explanation why so many people, even among abundance, feel grim and feel life is not what it should be or what it was supposed to be.
Yes.
Why was it important in a book about public things to have this quote here, to have this citation from de Tocqueville?
So, first of all, in a way, what he says about equality applies to public things as well, right? That you get close enough to enjoy their charms, sometimes not close enough to see the charm, not always close enough to enjoy the fullness of what it has to offer. And you develop in, I would say, an order inclined to privatization, a strange melancholic relationship to such things, that they're not surviving. They are being destroyed somehow. Their charms are diminished in the context of the rule of privatization. And so I found it very psychologically sensitive without being per se psychoanalytic. And I appreciate that about Tocqueville. The other thing that's important is a different quote that I think connects up with this one in Tocqueville, where he talks in Democracy in America in Volume 2. Volume 1 is about how great everything is, and Volume 2 is about how it's already falling apart 5 years later. And in Volume 2, he says, an American will build a house and then leave it before he's put the roof on. Spend years building a house and then leave it before, right? Or an American will plant trees in the garden of his house and leave before they fruit, right? And this kind of restlessness, this sense of always needing to be on the move, is now something that people call hustle, you know? But hustling is more a product, obviously, of the capitalist system that we're in, where you don't get one job and one set of health insurances and you spend your whole career there. Rather, you're always doing 3 or 4 jobs in order to be able to manage, and most of them are precarious and can be taken away at any time. So it's what Tocqueville sort of admired. He also diagnosed as a limitation of American life. He sort of admired that people were not overly attached to things. He also worried that that lack of attachment was a kind of psychotic state.
Psychotic state, yeah. It's interesting because the cliche a bit about always being on the move, going from one place to the next, has been always a cliche also about the Jewish people. And you go a bit further than the Tocqueville because you say that this habit, this addiction of many Americans, or quite a few Americans, to television programs about decorating their homes is a sign that they're not at home anymore, that they don't feel at home anymore, that they lost their feeling. And of course, we should not generalize too much, but that too many Americans lost the feeling of being at home.
Yeah, there is. I don't know if you have it here. I watch a French one sometimes, so I know that in Europe you have them. But shows about renovation, house buying, glorifying homemaking, but
it's
not
also here.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah.
but not the housekeeping kind of homemaking, the very grandiose kind of homemaking. I think of these at one point. I don't know if I talk about it in this book. Probably I do if you're mentioning it, but I do talk about it in Shell Shocked as a kind of displaced way of. The grandeur that one in a democracy we once invested in public things has gone private, and now it's just this over-the-top. How can you make your house look more like a hotel? You used to want your hotel to look more like a home, and now it's sort of come out the other side. But in both of those, what's gone missing is the great deal of care and investment of labor and money and time that went into the creation of public things, meaning for use by a public. So one of the examples I talk about in the Public Things book is Central Park, which we've mentioned, but not this detail yet. There are these tunnels that you go through in Central Park. If you watch the American crime shows, usually someone's murdered there, but that's just fiction. There are these beautiful tunnels, and when it came time to tile them, because they're all tiled, this is 150 years ago, when it was tiled, they chose to use Alhambra tiles. What's important about those for a democratic project is that the dye that is the design on the tile is all the way through the tile, not just on the surface. So as a result of this, they may get worn from use, but like the blanket, they remain. The design does not fade, because even if you wear the first 2, 3 levels off the top of the tile, the design is all the way down. I thought this was such a great metaphor. They were very expensive. And to me, they were chosen for this object permanence reason, right? It's a metaphor for democracy. Until it's fully gone, no matter how worn it is, it's still visible, it's still available.
And you mentioned it in this book, this particular anecdote about Central Park, also as a response to the aristocratic criticism of democracy that started with Plato, that if you make things common, I think the correct phrase is what you said, then you end up with the lowest common denominator crap.
Right.
So Central Park was an answer to Plato.
Yes.
We didn't know that, but
it was an
thanks to
answer also of Olmsted, the designer, to aristocratic critics of democracy in Europe at the time as well. And there's one more thing I was going to say about that. But the one thing to know is that it was built on the least desirable land that was sort of in the area of New York City at the time. It was all swamp. And that is the official story. And it's true, it was swamp. It was also where a lot of black people lived, and they were displaced by this construction project and had to move further away from the center of the city as a result, and were dispersed, so lost community and family modes of living.
I'd like to move to Rousseau for a moment, and to the word miracle.
Oh.
I won't ask you a definition of what you mean by miracle.
Thank you.
We know what a miracle can be. But miracle is a quite important word. It comes back also in emergency politics. You write, if on Rousseau's account we need a miracle, Rousseau's lawgiver, to get started, then we need one every day on mine.
every day.
On mine. On mine.
Huh. I have no idea what that means. I think it's
On
a typo.
mine. It's on mine.
Okay.
What kind of typo could it have been?
I have no idea. I thought you said online, and
No,
I thought, no, I didn't say that.
Mine, no. Maybe on forever? Maybe you meant something on...
I don't know.
We need one every day.
Maybe I meant Latin. Omine.
Omine?
I don't know. Anyway, it's
Okay,
good. What's the question?
We finish with every day.
Okay.
The law.
Yes.
In order to have a democracy, in order to have a state, you need a law. And the beginning of the law, at the beginning of everything, I mean the beginning of resistance, you need to, for every beginning, the beginning of overcoming a crisis, but also, I mean, especially when you mention Rousseau, the beginning of the law, the beginning of what you need to have a state, a democracy, you need a miracle. There's no foundation without something. Can I call it irrational? Or something beyond...
I would also call it improbable, though.
Improbable,
So
okay.
it doesn't, it might be irrational, but isn't necessarily that. It could just be what Machiavelli called fortuna, which is the good luck of the right guy being there at the right time to give good law, right? This is a part in Rousseau's social contract where he's talking about the founding of an ideal regime, which is one that would be devoted to equality. And he already believes, of course, that everybody in existence, anyone who might be interested in founding such a polity is somehow morally or politically corrupt. And so how would you start this ideal society in which people really experience themselves as equal? And he says, well, you would need good law. And then he's like, well, who's going to give us good law? These people? Sorry. These people? Are they going to give us good law? It has to come from good people. And where do good people come from? They're formed by good law. So this is what in political theory we call the paradox of politics, which is you can't have good law without good men, as Rousseau put it, to make it. And you can't have good men without formation by good law. So when you're starting a new regime, what do? And the way that he describes what can happen at that moment, or what has to happen, is a completely improbable, but it sometimes happens, event in which a lawgiver just shows up one day and is able to see objectively how to generalize law without promoting the interests of any particular subgroup in the regime, because the person is not a member of any particular faction. And really what Rousseau is doing with this example is he's giving a kind of personified version, the figure of the lawgiver, as what it would take to have really objective law that wouldn't be, no one would be suspicious, was a sort of covertly designed agenda that promotes one faction over others. And the whole point of Rousseau's experiment is to have a very small city-state in which there are no factions, right? In which people do not divide up into factions. So smallness, equality, and a law that comes in from somewhere else, born by a lawgiver who comes in from somewhere else, are all ways of talking about what are the necessary conditions of there being a real democracy, not the ones that call themselves that and let you vote once in a while, but the kind where people really feel co-constitutive, implicated in each other's lives, equal to each other, and no interest is allowed to prevail over others at the cost of the public good.
Did such a real democracy ever exist?
He thought, it's said that he was thinking of some of the Swiss cantons, as examples of where this was possible. Certainly people have said that it existed in ancient Athens, which was also a society that had enslaved people. But since they didn't count as part of the population, everybody else was equal. This is obviously not what Rousseau had in mind.
So maybe the best recommendation for Americans is to move to Graubünden.
The reason the lawgiver was attractive to me at the time, I was actually in a different book that I wrote called Democracy and the Foreigner, is because a surprising number of sort of cultural stories of the origins of your politics in Russia, in maybe it was Croatia, certainly in Jewish law, the founder, the lawgiver, is often someone who comes from somewhere else. It's a weird, not ethno-nationalist way of thinking about your beginnings. And I became very curious about what problem it would solve, because it seems to create problems for otherwise ethno-nationalist thinking. And the problem that it solves is the problem of objectivity, which no one ostensibly can be relied on to just produce.
The lawgiver was an outsider, has to be an outsider.
Yes, and in the case of Moses, for example, and the Israelites, whether or not you buy Freud's story that he really was an Egyptian.
I love that story.
But even if you don't buy it, even if you think he's genetically an Israelite, he still was raised in Pharaoh's household. So he has the frisson of foreignness that objectivity requires.
And when you think of the work of, for example, Walter Benjamin, the lawgiver of the beginning of the law is always comes with violence. There is a violent act needed in order to establish.
It is what Benjamin says.
Yes.
Yes, it is what Benjamin says.
Do you disagree with him?
I don't like always about anything. Okay. So immediately when you say that, I'm like, well, there must be some examples where that's not the case.
Okay.
So
I take the word always back.
But I do think that something that you could call violence attends it, which is to say it's not always destructive. You know, many people died at Sinai, for example, eventually with the, well, not at Sinai, but in the desert journey, because they didn't fit the requirements, let's just say. So this is a journey of violence as well as a journey of salvation, and it's part of the founding experience for that particular people. But I don't know that it, I don't know that I would agree with Benjamin on that, but I do think that he is onto something that is true, which is that in the act of reformation of a people, the change is such that even if there isn't sort of typical violence, there are experiences that are violent, demands for transformation, new orderings of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So every founding, in some sense, yes, comes with a law that will be violent. But mostly it's anarchists who really love that part of Benjamin. Because they want to say that all law is violent as such. And I'm tiptoeing around this because I don't want to say
that's
that.
Not what
I
he's
would
saying.
not
that's
say
not
that.
And that's not what Benjamin is saying.
Not, yes.
By the way, I'm not an anarchist. About the thingness of things, there's this interesting thing you say, that in neoliberalism or whatever state we want to call it, the thingness lose something. And that's what your concern here is, that they lose the political thingness. So you differentiate between the thingness of things and the political thingness of the objects of the things. And again, this is not a question about definition, but to get clearer, when does this thingness becomes political?
There's two ways to understand that. One is to say it becomes political when it becomes genuinely shared and enjoyed. And the other is it becomes political when it's being withdrawn from that sphere and people are contesting that withdrawal in order to protect it. I'll give you an example because it's a bit of an abstract sounding point. One of the examples that's in the book is about some kids, adolescents, who would play basketball every day in their neighborhood after school. It's a public park with a basketball court, so somewhat, disinvested neighborhood. The neighborhood is in San Francisco. The neighborhood starts to gentrify. This is in 2007, 2008. The neighborhood begins to gentrify, and some better off people, mostly white, move in, and they want to play basketball. And so they put together an app. And they go into the app. It's an app that will let you reserve a certain time on the basketball court. And so they book 5 p.m. This is complete news to the adolescents who've been playing basketball there for 10 years. And so they show up one day, these guys, with, wanting the court. And these other guys who've been playing there for their whole lives look at them like they just came from Mars. Like, what are you talking about? It's our time. What are you talking about? It's our time. And they say, well, here, look, and they have the app. Now, let's recall 2007, 2008, not quite everyone had apps and cell phones yet. It's not like now where no matter what your social class is, you probably have one. So they're, what should I say? They're puzzled. And they're like, what do you mean? what do you mean you reserve the time? This is our, and I just want to point out, it's a public space, it's a shared space, it's a community basketball court. If you want to play there and you just moved into the neighborhood, you could ask to join the game. You could show up at 5 and say, can we play too? But that's not what happened. Instead, they reserved the court. And in reserving the court, I would like to point out that what they reserved was not only space, but time. They reserved it for 5 to 6. So they privatized time and the use of the shared space through this app that no one else knew about or had access because they invented it, and which is already, I'm telling you who they were, living in San Francisco. So this is, to me, just a great example of how something that had solidity, it was there to be played on every day, became something evanescent and precarious. Now you never knew, if you didn't have a cell phone or access to the app, you never knew if you went to the corner to play basketball, if it would be reserved. And so
that's how you lose the
changed the
political
nature of the thing.
Yeah.
So the thing is still there, but its thingness is not there.
About the relation between the subject and the object, you go back again to Winnicott, very good author. And there's this quote about this longing for destruction in the child. A new feature, he writes, Winnicott, thus arrives, and it's a lengthy quote, but I will shorten it. The theory of object relating. The subject says to the object, I destroyed you. And the object is there to receive the communication. From now on, the subject says, hello, object, I destroyed you. I love you. You have value for me because of your survival, of my destruction of you. While I am loving you all the time, I'm destroying you in an unconscious fantasy. I would say this is not only a lovely description of this relationship between the subject and the object, but also of all love. Isn't it? And then you go further, and I won't quote it, but I will paraphrase you, that maybe, and this is again not about definitions, but you give a definition here yourself in your book, maybe neoliberalism is just this raging child.
Mm-hmm. And then what? It could be.
If this is the case, if this whole privatization, if all this, what we are talking about for decades already, not you talk about it, but the public debate, so maybe we are talking about a raging child.
Yes.
That's my question. And what would be the implication? What would be the next step if this is the case?
So what's very important, the other term from Winnicott that we haven't talked about yet, is the idea of a holding environment, which is sort of the parent's duty, if possible, to create for the child. And that is a space in which, or a time in which, not only is the blanket destroyed, but more important, and then survives, but more importantly that it's not lost, or if it is lost, that something else is provided to take its place. But there's a kind of space in which it's not like you can prevent a child from experiencing any kind of trauma, but that any kind of trauma is survivable if there is a holding environment. So the question is, and this goes back to what we're looking to public things for, the question is, can a democracy do that? Can a politics do that? Can we understand our collective project of being together in our differences and working collaboratively in the midst of disagreement as a kind of, committing to a kind of holding environment in which we go on together even after moments of potential destruction, and that we learn a kind of civic love for each other in the moments of destruction, where even though we may have done, as many societies have experienced, terrible things to each other, we nonetheless have to find a way to go on. There is, I wouldn't say in such cases in a political context, I would not describe that kind of destruction as an expression of love, but I would say that the going on together afterwards can sometimes be done improbably in the spirit of love.
In the spirit of love.
Yes, yeah. a civic love.
A civic love. I think time has come to talk about Lars von Trier.
Yes, I think it was 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, I'm a bit late. Excuse me, I'm a bit late. I apologize.
No, because destruction and
no,
love,
of course,
we were there.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote a book about Lars von Trier, but Lars von Trier's movie Melancholia plays a different role, an important role in your book. And I was a bit surprised by your interpretation of the movie, but also I was surprised that you liked von Trier so much. In 2011, A.O. Scott, the famous critic of the New York Times, wrote about Melancholia, among other things, this. The expectation of punishment is, of course, one reason people go to a Lars von Trier movie in the first place. Suffering, predominantly, though not exclusively, the suffering of women, is both his favorite subject and his preferred method. He's a crafty sadist, but also for all his tricks and provocations, a sincere one. So maybe we should seek redemption by looking for a crafty sadist?
So as I said, I think it's part of my political project to find emancipatory possibilities in unlikely places. I think you've just shared that he was an unlikely source for emancipatory possibilities. But I'll also say that, I don't know, have many people here seen the movie Melancholia? Yes?
Maybe you can explain a bit. It's about the wedding. People go to a wedding. Most people are unhappy. Lars von Trier made this movie also after severe depression. And then there's this planet coming called Melancholia that might or might not destroy life on Earth.
Don't watch it alone. This is just my only advice. It's better if you watch it with a friend. So I will say that I agree with what A.O. Scott said about most of von Trier's films. I don't think it is, I would say, the least misogynist of his films. Is that a compliment?
That's a compliment.
And that the suffering, the suffering that the women, especially the two main figures in the sisters in the film, that they experience is mostly not at the hands of a man, which is different from some of his other films as well. Yeah. And this, I think, is what made it possible for me to think with this film. So I didn't write about the film as a fan of the film, although I did. It's hard to call it an enjoyment, but I did learn from the film, and I found it very inspiring to think with, because it presents at least four, but also a few more in smaller roles, personifications of how people deal with catastrophe. And each one, in their own way, a recognizably human way. One by wanting to be in denial about it and just to go on with the soirees and the wine drinking and, bourgeois life. And another with melancholia, suffering from a kind of melancholia that is native to her being, but also appropriate to the moment. And then the one man who is a source of some pain himself, I don't want to say too much, but choosing a private way out of the catastrophe. So they all seem to me to represent these different possibilities that I think coexist in most of us. We are pulled in all of these directions in a very compelling way. And it was written as a catastrophe film, and most people saw it as a catastrophe film. But I think, to go back to your earlier quotation about capitalism, it's also very obviously a metaphor for, what planet is hitting us. It's not called melancholia, it's called capital.
You didn't use the words holding environment, but of course the end of the movie is also like, and you phrase it like it's they Justine, and she comes up with a magic cave and a new ritual that's unlike other rituals, didn't still have meaning. I think there's this alternative holding environment. My proposal is that we're now going to watch the end of the movie. I apologize to all those people who are watching this from their homes, because for copyright reasons you will see a black screen, but bear with me.
That's how it ends anyway.
That's only a few minutes. Okay. Melancholia, Lars von Trier, 2011. Charlotte Gainsbourg is amazing in the movie, I would say. Yes, she is, isn't she? Yeah. In many other, also in other von Trier movie, but that's not okay. Let's forget that other movie. You write about this movie that it's not about survival, about the ending. That maybe, and I found this a very interesting remark. So maybe the resistance, or what, if this is the right word for it, the need to resist a certain order, is not about surviving. If this is the case, and I was reminded also of a famous novel by an Italian author. You might know the novel, The Garden of the Finzi Continis, by George Bassani. It's about a bourgeois Jewish family in Ferrara, not far from Bologna, upper middle class, and they believe that it's beyond their dignity, below their dignity, to resist or to escape. Mm-hmm. They play tennis while waiting for the Nazis.
Oh my.
And to me,
there's Charlotte Gainsbourg.
There's a connection.
Yeah.
And if you like this movie so much, and I think, and I share your opinion, maybe this is all that we can do.
Play tennis while we wait for the Nazis. That lands a little differently now than it would have a few years ago.
Yeah. Or make our secret cave, whatever. The difference between playing tennis and the secret cave is not that big.
So it's interesting. I feel the what's called the magic cave in the movie and by commentators is this teepee structure with no skin, right? It's the sticks of a teepee without the leather that would normally be around it in a proper teepee. I think I read this film alongside a book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope. And that book is, and I feel the von Trier film, I speculate at one point actually that the von Trier film that von Trier may have read this book by Jonathan Lear, which came out 5 or 10 years earlier, partly because I brought a slide for this, but I won't trouble you with it. On the cover of Jonathan Lear's book is a teepee structure with no skin. It's almost identical to what these people built. Jonathan Lear is writing about how indigenous peoples survived somehow the end of their way of life. So this teepee represents a kind of what's left, which is virtually nothing and no protection from the outside, but something nonetheless survives. And he talks in the book philosophically and politically, culturally, what's necessary to be able to even say that you survived as a people if very little of your way of life has survived. So how to go through the end of your world and come out the other side. And maybe experience one day, but this is not the redemptive hope that helps you, but maybe experience one day a resurgence of what was lost. What I really, reading the film and the book alongside each other, what I really admired about the film was how, not Charlotte Gainsbourg, Kristen Dunst, who is a melancholic in the film. She suffers from depression her whole life, and has tried to end her life at different points in time. And, you know, you get this kind of backstory as you're watching. It's her wedding. And I think what's important about her character is that she's in the depression her whole life. She is out of sync with the world. It's a world of progress, hopefulness, wealth, incredible wealth. And yet she suffers. And then the world-ending catastrophe comes, and what was a disease is now the right affect for this moment. It's because she has always experienced the world as precarious rather than as there for her, like her sister did, that she is able to make herself available to her nephew, the little boy that you just saw in the scene. The mother, Charlotte Gainsbourg, of the little boy, as you saw, is not available for him. I think that bothered me a lot, to be so caught up in your own suffering that you are not available to the child seemed to me to be a not quite good enough mother. But it is the case that von Trier, who also suffers from depression, so this is perhaps a somewhat self-serving narrative, positions the person who suffers from depression as the one to meet the moment, because what's going on in the catastrophe of the world, not just this one but others, deserves such a response. it's not quite the same as playing tennis till the Nazis come, although, I don't have any judgments to make about fictional or real people's ways of getting through these things. But I do look for moments of potentially empowering, democratizing modes of response. It seemed to me that what's here is thin, but what's here is, you only have a few minutes left before this probable catastrophe is happening. You can't be certain until it actually happens. There's this speculation it might miss the planet. So you only have a few minutes left. What do you do with it? Well, what the Kirsten Dunst sister proposes doing with it is entering into play with the child, which is a kind of world-making activity, according to both Winnicott and Arendt. So in the face of catastrophe, you remake a world. It's a very bare one. There's no time to do any more anyway. But it does create, it's enough to create, just like this table, which is nothing, creates a possibility of a kind of material for conversation. It positions them to be in circle together. And the move to hold hands, that's the one sister to the other, who they have been angry with each other for a long time. But the Kirsten Dunst and the boy are holding hands through this whole time. That sense of holding each other, that's why it's called a holding environment, that sense of holding each other seems to me to be a kind of metaphor for the action in concert that Arendt describes as the mode of political life, that we hold each other, we get through things together. They're not all great. Sometimes they're quite rough.
But, so maybe we underestimate play and playfulness. And I think, although that's the name you didn't mention, of the Dutch cultural historian Huizinga, who wrote a whole book about Homo Ludens, about play and playfulness as like the major aspect of whole culture.
Yes, I think I cite him somewhere, but I did read his work at the time, and I did think, you could go in this whole direction of Homo Ludens, but you make choices. So in the end, I think he got a footnote. I gave a Dutch traffic engineer a whole chapter.
Like, before we go, yeah.
But
I
the
think
traffic
nobody knows him.
got
Hans Mondeman. Anybody here who knows Hans Mondeman? No.
Traffic engineer, very creative.
Traffic engineer. From Friesland.
You should find him on YouTube. He's unfortunately passed away, but he lives on YouTube.
You give him all the credit, and the hopeful note in your epilogue, you base it basically on the work of Hans Mondeman, and I quote you, "Mondeman's faith in the ability of people to self-regulate, adjust, reorganize, and accommodate each other without rules to tell them what to do is virtually anarchistic." Oh, anarchistic, that's again. So is his belief in the power of good design to promote such autonomy, so is his belief in the power of good design to promote such autonomy and the power of bad design to thwart it.
Yes. So maybe a little too close to the house renovation.
To connect. This is for me also connected to the whole ability to play and to be playful, to self-regulate. I mean, how otherwise can you develop these skills without playing?
Well, we learn to self-regulate through play, but it's also true that our whole lives, as Winnicott would say, we're sometimes retaught the lesson of the importance of regulation by others who look shocked when we say or do something, and then we learn again and again. It reminds me to mention that with the talk of the lawgiver before, the paradox of politics is understood at the beginning, but it recurs every day because every day we wake up again with some of our old impulses and some of our new impulses we need to be re-regulated, as it were. And we do this for each other. People who live by themselves or people who are so wealthy that nobody ever disagrees with them get dysregulated because no one is there to regulate them. And you know who I'm talking about, I assume, since I mentioned their names earlier. And play is a sort of one place where that happens. There are others. But it is one place where that happens. In holding environments, the act of play, which in this film builds the holding environment, that's one of the things that play does, it's world building. And it's also, Winnicott says, where we experiment with what will be acceptable to others, and we find out. Little children sometimes cheat at a game, and they need to find out that that's not okay, or that they will get away with it under certain circumstances. But there's always this kind of what we call, and what psychoanalysts also call reality checking. Like, is there going to be pushback? There are also many politicians that do this as well, where they try something outlandish and see. Let's see how it lands. And I can get away with this too.
But we promised not to speak about Gaza tonight, didn't we? Yeah. I'd like to end my conversation, and I could have a whole conversation about your book. I have the 30th anniversary edition here for me, Political Theory, the Displacement of Politics. And especially about, I mean, we could speak about Kant, Arendt, Nietzsche, they're all mentioned in here. You start with Kant, Nietzsche, Arendt. Rawls, the 4th chapter, famous because of his idea that if you have the veil of ignorance, you have the just society. And then you come up with a side character in his work, which is, to me, very interesting and very appealing. And he's an ill-fitting man, a bit like maybe the ill-fitting woman in von Trier's movie. This man, that's a man, I believe,
yes.
is a grass counter. He counts grass, leaves
That's
of grass.
just what he likes to do.
He's also a very talented mathematician, but he likes to count grass. And then society, this just society, by Rawls, doesn't know how to respond to it. And there's this sentence you write, for example, the gap between the grass counter's expectation of indifference and experience of intervention is a side of politics, but Rawls, and that's you're a critic of him, never addresses it. I'd like to talk with you about the grass counter. He's so important to me.
Me too.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
We share this love for him.
Yes. Well, yes. So it's the famous example. It's called the grass counter in Rawls, and well, it's now famous. It wasn't
you made
famous.
It famous.
I may have helped to make it famous. Yeah. So and what he's doing in this example, which many people don't take very seriously, is he's trying to imagine. So he's created in his theory a very tolerant society where everyone's basic needs are met. And so he thinks he's gotten rid of most of the sources of intolerance. It's a just society. It's kind of like a good enough justice. It's not perfect. There's still differences in wealth and capacities, but mostly it creates a sense of collectivity. Thin, so that individuals can pursue their private goods with great relish and enjoyment, free to do whatever they like. And then he decides, I love this in political theory where people do this, he decides to pose a hard case for himself. He doesn't wait to be criticized. And he says, well, let's consider, will they really be tolerant and just, these people that I've imagined who will be brought into being by this very just social arrangement? Well, let's see. What if there was a guy, he says, he doesn't need anything from society because he can solve difficult mathematical problems, he gets paid for that, he's fine materially. But he has this weird penchant for counting blades of grass. This is what he likes to do all day long. He sits in the park and he counts blades of grass. I know you're looking at me like, what? Yeah, what? It's a what? What is this? Counting. So he cannot give a rational account of why he does it. He cannot give a good reason that one should spend time that way. He cannot say that others should be influenced by him because it's a wonderful way of life. So what do we do about him? So number one, the question is, what do we do about him? Which to me already carries some lack of tolerance, like we have to do something about him. He calls for our attention. He doesn't. He doesn't want our attention. And then his
whole existence is a question to all the people living in this just society.
Yes. It's because somehow it is this, even though Rawls rejects perfectionism as a politics and an ethos, that we should all strive always to be better because he's a liberal, he wants you to be free to be mediocre if you want to be or excellent if you want to be. So he sort of says, let's be liberals about that and let people do what they want. But this guy is the limit case because maybe something's wrong with him. What normal person would do that, right? And so he looks into it and he says, he develops the example a little bit. He's not the most literary thinker, but this is a page of what should we do about him? And then they question him, the grass counter. They ask him, if this is really your pleasure, how could this be your pleasure? And then at some point, Rawls says, they satisfy themselves that this is really what he wants to do, and he enjoys it. And so they will leave him alone. But not, I point out, until they've spent several days questioning him, checking, giving him a brain scan or whatever, checking to see that he's really okay. Not accepting on the surface of what they see, but digging down a little bit, which is a marginalizing, stigmatizing set of procedures to be subjected to. But he doesn't really worry about that because he's trying to, I give him the credit, give himself a test case and be very honest about how it would run. And it's enough, and maybe it is a good enough society, that having asked all those questions, they then say, okay, enjoy your grass, right?
Yeah, but there is, But I think you are hinting also at the sequel that in my fantasy obviously will come. If catastrophe will arrive at this just society, many people in the society will look for a scapegoat and they will find the grass counter. And I think if we kill the grass counter, catastrophe will fade away. This is, to me, the logical development.
Yeah,
and I think this is what you were hinting at, but maybe I understood you.
You know, my text may hint at that. I don't remember being consciously hinting at that. But I did write, I don't think I thought of it that way, of him as I did think of him as a scapegoat, but not in this sense.
But a scapegoat is always the danger of violence.
Absolutely, of the outsider.
Yeah.
So instead, I hinted then and said more clearly now in the 30th anniversary edition of this book, I wrote a new preface. I think he's queer. I mean, he is someone who doesn't enjoy the same pleasures as everyone else. He passes as a straight single man. And he requires some quizzicality from everyone else to see if he's really taking pleasure in something that's not supposed to give you pleasure. To me now, I mean, in 1990 is when I wrote it, but now I read it and I think, oh my God, he's just totally queer. And the literary figure that I compare him to now is Ferdinand the Bull. So do people know that children's book, Ferdinand the Bull? It's about a young bull who loves playing with flowers and lying on the grass. And all the other bulls fight, you know, but he has a good mother, and his mother says, don't you want to go play with the other bulls? And he says, no, I just like sitting here under the cork tree on the grass playing with the flowers. And she says, okay, because that's who you are, right? And a lot of people read this book at the time by Leif Munro. Do you know it? Dutch maybe has a different name? Yeah, the steer. Okay, so thank you. So it was published in 1936 by Leif Munro. It's set in Spain. And the other bulls are taken off to the bullfights, and so is Ferdinand eventually, and he's expected to fight because he seems like, it's a long story. It's a very short book, but it's a long story. I won't give you all the details. You should definitely read it if you don't know it. So, but the thing is that at the time, because he was refusing to fight, it was seen as a pacifist story against getting involved in the Spanish Civil War. And then later, some people started to say, I think he's gay. Ferdinand is gay. And then they wanted to ban the book in the United States in the 1950s because it was a children's book about a gay bull. But now I think the grass counter is maybe a leftover of Ferdinand the Bull. John Rawls is just about the right age that he might have been a child in 1936. So, but it's a similar story, and we have so many such stories. You call it in the book. It's the remainder. He is one of the remainder characters in the book.
And basically, that's also your criticism in the next chapter of Michael Sandel, is that the traditional liberal position that whatever adults or an adult do with other consenting adults in their private homes is not, it cannot survive. There is something in this position that's not genuine.
So for Sandel, he's very concerned about reproduction in every way and about forms of life that are sustainable. This is a book written in the 80s that I'm responding to in the 90s. I don't really know what his position would be now. Many of us have reconsidered many elements of our positions in the last 30 years. But at the time, what he's particularly opposed to in his book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, are forms of sexual pleasure that do not involve others. So he's particularly concerned with people, watching porn, and engaging in self-pleasuring activities, but not with others, because the whole point when I call it reproductive, it isn't necessarily just pregnancy, but reproducing sociality through other pleasure as well as politics. And, that idea that you're sexuality is somehow not contributive is one usually used to target gay people. So even though that's not exactly what he's talking about, certainly the idea that when you're with someone of the same sex, you might as well be alone was a common slur at the time. So in this sense, I made some connections there that I don't think he necessarily had in mind, Sandel. But the idea that all of your pleasures, or that pleasure as such, should model or mirror the community's mode of living together, this is what I wanted to criticize. Because it was, to me, a betrayal of the kinds of exploration and adventure and risk that democracies should be invested in and permissive of. Yeah.
So we should not reduce ourselves to only pleasure-seeking animals? Or is this too moralistically phrased? What do you mean by... Maybe I miss... What do you mean exactly by pleasure and democracy?
What I mean is that democracy is not only about equality, but also about freedom. And unless things people are doing test the fundamental tenets of democracy, there should be wide spectra of toleration, and not just toleration, but respect and even shared enjoyment, that there is a plurality and diversity of ways that people have of being. But this also reminds me to say one other thing, because one reading of this grass counter is that he's a kind of queer figure. But another reading, which I'm quite tempted by now, which I wouldn't have come to then, is that it's about neurodiversity. And the fundamentals of Rawls's theory of liberal justice are fundamentally rationalist. It's about giving good reasons for any departures from radical equality have to be well-reasoned and all the rest. And, I'm not an anti-rationalist. I love reason. You
cannot be reasonable all the time.
But we're not reasonable all the time.
Exactly.
And when we try to be, we are doing harm to others. And I think from the perspective of neurodiversity that we've learned much more about in the last 30 years since I wrote this book, it seems to me that this is a demand for neuroconformity. That's what, if I could rewrite the book, I would be able to say it more crisply.
Maybe that's also why you quote, because it was a bit awkward, but I like it, that Winnicott and the musical, that he writes about the musical in Public Things.
Oh,
and
yes.
And this is where the dances are, and
yes.
Nowadays we'd call it like maybe lower entertainment, but he says, no, this is life. Musical, yes. This is life, yes. Life with capital Life. This is life. I think this is also a nice moment to open the discussion to the public. Veronica will walk around with a mic. Please wait till she is there, and then you can answer. You can not answer. You can ask the question, and Bonnie will answer the question. I think this is what we are going to do. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, go. Yeah.
Hello. To be honest, I haven't read your book, but I have, to make a little bridge, read The Life and Death of Great Cities, Great American Cities, about
yes.
Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
And my question is to you, very briefly, how abstract can a public thing be? For me, my blanket is Amsterdam and everything that is within it. So I have critiques of it, but the thing I love, the thing I always will be, is Amsterdam, and was also...
Your blanket is Amsterdam, you said.
My blanket is Amsterdam. So how abstract can a public thing be, is my question to you. So maybe you have to answer it in your book, but...
You should buy the book. It's interesting. Some cities are very good at enhancing their public thingness, and others treat themselves as just a collection of individual households. I do think of Amsterdam as one of the cities that is more of a public thing type city. I think New York is another one, although it's disintegrated into many different boroughs that each has their own thing going on as well. I think that's really the question of the book. I can't give you an answer like when it reaches this point it's too abstract, but I can say that once a public thing has reached a certain point of abstraction, and it may be a different point for different ones, then the thingness of the thing is under pressure. That's what I would say. And so it has to have a kind of resilience, a kind of materiality, so that it pushes back against, that it survives the effort, even the unknowing effort to destroy it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's an architectural thing, but people don't see it as a public as a public thing, as a political thing.
Yeah.
But it is a political thing. It is something that we build as a society.
Yes. And choices were made.
We don't see it that way.
Yes.
People walk by it every day and just think this is a house, this is something. But this is so political, but it's an architectural style in a way. But
Architecture is also politics.
So
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
So Melbourne is like that for me as a city as well, where it announces itself in an architectural declaration of its existence. But you're also reminding me, if I can take just 1 second, that I didn't say enough about Monderman before, and this is speaking of neighborhoods and cities, is that Monderman, who is Dutch, and it's odd to me that I fell in love with his way of doing traffic engineering, and no one here knows who he is. I think the reason you asked me why I wrote about him, and the reason I wrote about him was partly because in the US, where he was known, he was beloved by libertarians, because it seemed like he didn't want too many red lights, too many arrows, too much signage to tell you what to do. He wanted, through subtle, what we would now call nudging, right? Through the subtle nudging of design, the street gets cobblestone, so you'll drive slower instead of saying 30, 15, or whatever the kilometer versions of that you have to slow down here. And you just adjust. You make a series of kind of nudging adjustments. That's you get a kind of neighborhood effect, but without the directedness
Power of the
of
state.
signs. Yeah.
And also you thought that too many signs, too many directions would be dangerous for the people who use the street.
He thought too many signs meant that the space was badly designed, and I think that's right. And when a space is badly designed and you can't tell, there's one like this in Boston that always drives me crazy. It says the highway is this way, but then there's 2 roads you could go on, and you don't know if the arrow is for the one before or the one after. And each time I feel like I might be going to my death with this choice. Like, I'm not sure which one it is. So eventually the signage increases. There'll be one accident, and then there'll be 10 more signs, because we're also a very legalistic society. So there have to be 10 signs so no one can sue you for not giving good direction. But Monderman said, when there's a lot of signs, he has these great pictures that he shows of these intersections with 1,000 signs, and you have to sit there for 10 minutes and interpret the text before you could go anywhere. But really it's a sign of, not of care in design with all the signage, but the opposite.
But that's what I think an important remark, that the signs are there in order to not be sued.
Yes, yes.
Okay, next question.
Yes, hello, my name is Laura Davies. I'm doing a PhD in legal philosophy. Thank you very much for the talk and for all your work, actually. I also had a question about the public things, because as I understand them, these public things, they orient us towards society and towards each other. But again, I guess they also orient us towards the future. Because in the Netherlands, a big part of our country is below sea level. So we have as a big public thing, both culturally and as a protection, we have our dikes. And that's something you build upon and you want it to survive also for future generations. And when I see now the classes I teach, I teach philosophy to law students, that over the past years it's been way harder to, if you explain ethical dilemmas, to get them to kind of explain why they should even help another person. Because we're getting way more and more individualized all the time. So my question is, how can public things help us to orient us towards the future and to kind of leave this place better than we might have found it?
So that's a great question. Thank you. I think that I think of Hannah Arendt's motif of care for the world, which is a recognition that it's our holding environment, this planet is, or the part that our country is on is, interconnected with all the others. And that, excuse me, and that this care for the world is an expression of our mutuality, of our dependence on each other and on the world, not being blown up tomorrow. But my favorite, if we're talking about teaching, my favorite technique of asking students to think about these things, where it's also an issue, obviously, in American politics and culture, that people begin from a sort of default assumption of autonomy and then ask, what do I owe? Now, biblically, I believe that was first said by Cain about Abel when he was asked by God, "Where's your brother?" And he's like, "Why should I know? Yeah. What is he to do with me?" So we have a biblical background that suggests that kind of statement, "What is he to do with me? I'm on my own," is maybe not the most ethical position to begin from. But not all the Bible stories should be taken on their face. The more important, I think, technique, is to ask them to consider all of the public things that they had to use to get to the classroom that day. Did they drive on a road? Did they bike on a road? Were there big holes in it? Or were there mines somewhere in the field that they walked across? Oh, no holes, no mines, no obstacles that you couldn't overcome. Why is that? Why is the world so prepared for your traffic in it and for you to pass without impediment? I think even of Hobbes, who had a very thinned down version of freedom, so that no sovereign could be ever accused of breaching yours. But even his thinned down version ultimately amounted to the idea that you should be physically unimpeded. Anything else, if you're psychically threatened or constrained in other kinds of ways, that didn't violate your freedom. That's why I say it's a very thin one. You could be threatened. That's all in your head. But if someone stops you physically, if they arrest you, if they stop you, that is a violation of your freedom. And, there's so much unimpeded motion in the modern world because someone else has taken care of it for you, created traffic circles that work, engineered buildings to keep you warm on a cold day as you walk, so you can stop and rest in them and so on. All of these things are there because someone has provided them. They're not there by nature. And so when people start talking about, wanting their tax dollars back and not wanting to spend on, wanting to just pay for the road when they use it and not through taxes when others maybe are using it, which is something that happens in the US, tolls on roads so that only the users are paying for them. Those are all ways of beginning with autonomy. Then I also ask them how they were born. Did they come out of somebody else, maybe? What were the circumstances of their entry into the world? And why would they expect to live in it differently from how they enter into it, enmeshed with another? Those are just some thoughts.
Maybe read a bit of Winnicott. That would be helpful also.
Yes, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Your work and Winnicott. I have space for 2 more questions.
There's someone back there.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. I actually wanted to go back to kissing the typewriter.
I already regret that joke, but go ahead.
My question is twofold. I think on the one hand, how you speak about how Arendt takes holding each other and the care for the world, like she vehemently disagrees with neighborly love, right? At several points in her discussions, she explicitly actually says that this is not a good idea. And then, am I hearing that perhaps actually for her project, democratic project to work, that it is actually neighborly love is an important, if not crucial, element of that? That's one question I had.
So she has a very particular idea about love, which is that it's a destabilizing passion, if I may take a little bit of liberty. It's not exactly how she would put it, is what I mean, but I think that the way she sees it is somewhat like the way Hegel talks about marriage. It's like it's inherently destabilizing as a relationship because it engenders such passion, including anger, right? And that's why he says he prefers the brother-sister relationship as a model for social organization because there's no passion. He uses Antigone, who's an incest, to illustrate that belief, which is an odd choice. But there we are. So she is critical of love and Christian ideas of neighborly love as the bases, the proper affect for collective life. But she is not. She does have accounts of the things people do for each other, especially in emergency situations where people sacrifice themselves to save others. She just doesn't want, in this kind of neo-Hegelian way, to make neighborly love the basis of politics. It can be the basis of community life, but what political life requires is courage, is the appropriate passion for political life, and care for the world, also a kind of passion, and commitment to each other's equality and plurality, to going on together in our difference. So I think she just thinks that neighborly love is too little and too much, both, for what politics requires. I want to say something about kissing the typewriter, because if I could reach one right now, I would kiss it. And the reason is, and I do regret that joke a little bit, at the time the world was a bit different. I think precisely because we're in a slightly different world than we were when I wrote that in the middle 90s, the place of patriotic or constitutional patriotism, which is what Habermas was offering at the time, was supposed to give you the passion of ethno-nationalism without the division of ethno-nationalism. This was like the middle position. And it seemed to me to be, inadequate on the affective front and masquerading as if it was adequate. But times change, and right now in the US, there are politicians claiming that they're going to get rid of birthright citizenship, which is the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution, which gave anyone born in the territory and jurisdiction of the United States citizenship as a matter of birth. The reason for it was that there were enslaved people who'd been recently emancipated, and there were questions about, what was their status? Were they migrants? Did they have any claims? And in order to establish without any doubt their belonging and their deservingness of rights, this amendment claimed that birth would just decide it, right? And so it was for 100 years, and now all of a sudden birthright citizenship is being questioned as not what was meant, because it also says jurisdiction. And so if you're born here, but you weren't under the jurisdiction of the United States, which is to say if you were illegal or undocumented, then maybe you don't have that right of birth citizenship. So when I joked and said, well, if there was a typewriter nearby now, I would kiss it, it is to say that suddenly not just constitutional patriotism, but a kind of commitment to constitutionalism as what we have to live by, and not subject to radical reinterpretation for the purposes of excising members of the society, seems really important to me. And perhaps there were good historic reasons why it felt really important to Habermas in the 90s.
Yes, he wrote very much in the context, of course. We cannot forget that he was German, is German.
Yes.
And that the German history and the German attempt at renewal was very important to him.
Yes,
and also,
course.
Speaking of Arendt, in your book Political Theory, you criticize Arendt also for her explicit refusal to include sexual orientation, gender, religion in the realm of politics.
Yes. That's because with the thinkers that you love, you show your love through criticism. So there were parts of her argument that I felt were not as all-encompassing as they should be. I've changed my mind a little bit about that because I think, not that she should not have spoken about those things, but I think there's something very all-encompassing in her political theory that requires less, that it lets it be, that there is a kind of, if you're thinking in terms of care for the world, plurality, and equality, which I take to be the three key themes of everything she writes, then the rest would just take care of itself.
Be quiet.
And it's not that you should be quiet about it, but it's that she chose other idiosyncrasies and non-normative behaviors to talk about. Yeah, that's all. That's all I'll say about that.
2 more questions, and then we finish up. Maybe, yeah.
I will give it back. Thanks for your interesting conversation, the both of you. I'm actually glad you brought up Habermas, because I was wondering how public things relate to the public sphere, which is one of his terms. You said the table is a material thing, but it promotes conversation. And for Habermas, the public sphere is also something in which we talk about conflicts. So how do you see the public sphere?
So I have to confess that it's been a while since I worked on Habermas's work, since the mid-90s when I wrote about it. So I'll be maybe a little sketchy. But part of the motivation, I could say, for writing about public things was partly to, I had this earlier question about when do they become so abstract that they don't count, they don't do this work. And I think the public sphere might be one of those things that has a kind of abstractness to it. And if you sort of dig down into it, what it comes down to are a set of mutual respects, equality and reasoning, giving good reasons and accounts of what you favor. So largely procedural, conversational in the public sphere in ways that you're not obliged to be in other spheres of life, perhaps. But calling it a sphere is itself, where is it? And I'm not criticizing him for that. I'm just, if you're asking why I would talk about public things and not about the public sphere, it's first of all because I am also interested in the affective sources of contestation and affirmation, which are a little bit outside the usual Habermasian understanding of the public sphere. And second of all, because I am really interested in the what Jane Bennett calls the vibrancy of things and the magnetizing powers of things. This is why I answered the other question about, think about how you got to the classroom today, what public things enabled your passage. That's the way some public things don't necessarily announce themselves, and you can miss them. And so calling your attention to the things that enable you to live the life you're living can sort of kickstart the magnetization process, where now you walk down the street and you realize, well, I'm not afraid because there's a street light here, One of the things I point out in the Shell Shock book, which is about the first set of Trump years, is that this movie called Gaslight, which is about tricking a woman into losing her reality, begins. It doesn't just have the bad gaslighter, who is the husband who's tricking her and undoing her sense of orientation and belonging to the world. The movie opens with a public servant, a gaslighter, lighting the lamp on the street so that everyone can walk safely in the dark. So even though the term has come to be associated with this very bad guy who takes away your world, it begins with the promise of the good guy, the civil public servant, who gives you the world so that you're not totally enveloped by darkness. I think that that's a great, that missed gaslighter is a great lesson to us in how we miss all the good public things that give us the world and only find ourselves noticing the traumatic violations of it.
That's often the case, no?
Yes.
The last question. I think yeah.
Well, thank you. I just wondered whether you would perhaps tell us or say a bit more about current political situation, the current Trump regime. I cannot help but thinking that Arendtian notions like care for the world, holding, etc., care for things, might be too weak an answer at the moment. I'm sorry, but Arendt doesn't help much in my view. Could you
what doesn't help
elaborate?
much?
Arendt doesn't help
Arendt
much, she
helps
said.
Arendt.
But can I ask you, is someone else helping you?
If not, if not Arendt, who?
Perhaps politicians who point to power more.
So Arendt's definition, I'm not a religious or orthodox Arendtian, but let's just start here. Arendt's definition of power is that it's different from violence, and what it is what happens when people join together in common cause. They have a power together out of this collectivity. I actually think she's a great thinker for the moment, but not just because of the 3 bromides that you mentioned. I agree that care for the world doesn't sound like much, except when it sounds like everything. I also think that when people have been asking me what to do in this impossible moment, I mean, I'm not someone who goes around telling people what to do. But, you know, join something is my answer. Join a movement. Go to the meetings. I know not everybody loves the meetings, but you can't be in the movement if you don't go to the meetings. And bring people food who don't have food, or, you know, shelter someone who needs to be sheltered at this particular moment. These are things that take you out of yourself and give you a sense of belonging at a moment where you are being dispossessed by the larger national operations of the day. I think for many people, it's also a particularly difficult moment because many of those in power have been credibly accused of violence and or rape. I've actually started just calling this regime a rapeocracy, which is ruled by rapists. And I think it's important to name that because it is not coming from a politically correct place of all kinds of sex or rape or anything like that. It's really that it seems to be necessary to have been credibly accused of sexual violence in order to get a job in this administration. And I think that makes it very difficult for a lot of people, especially those who have traumatic pasts, to be engaged at this moment. It's a kind of, you know, it's a traumatic withdrawal for many people. And again, the answer is join with others, because the traumatized response is to re-isolate, and the political power response is to join with others.
Yeah. Speaking of Trump, should we make a distinction between people living in the US, being able to vote there, or at least living there, and those people who live in other spaces? When you speak of joining, I mean, of course, what Trump, the US is an empire, and what the US does will have consequences for all the world. But still, if you live here, you have a different relationship, I guess, with Trump, and maybe it's better to focus on your own government, or not?
Oh, I see. I'm sorry if I missed that part of the question.
I'm not sure if that was the question.
Oh,
That's
okay. This is a whole new question.
Yeah,
okay. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I remember this being a big debate at the time when Habermas was giving us the theorization of the public sphere, which is that with many countries, it's equal input for all those affected, but often all those affected are elsewhere, not within this particular public sphere. And so how do we enumerate who's affected? I told a story earlier today about visiting Poland in 1987, and there was this thing that was going on in Poland at the time where a lot of farmers were reporting that their cows were dying. There were many cows dying, and they were trying to figure out what was happening. Why were all their cows dying? And they decided it was coming from Russia, and so from the radiation, and so they were all still a satellite at the time, but at the same time, they were experiencing the effects of something that had happened elsewhere, and there was no. First of all, there was no accounting for it at all. But it was one example in my mind right now of like how, not that they were voting in Russia, but how there isn't accountability for these public impacts. So this is an issue. And we have international institutions that are supposed to be enabling of certain kinds of accounting. We also have international courts whereby other governments are sued for the impacts. The current regime in the US is not one to expect to comply with court findings or to be answerable to demands for accounting. So really the question at some level...
To say the least.
Yeah, right. And so really the question at some level is, you know, how do you take a politics of accountability and mobilize it against a politics that's proudly unaccountable? We don't even have hypocrisy as a challenge anymore because it's all so shameless. And I think one of the reasons, I'll risk saying this even though I'm not really a scholar of American politics, but I think one of the reasons the Democrats for the first couple of weeks were a little bit frozen is because their habit is to say, okay, well, you didn't believe us when we told you, so now see, you know, and like let it be seen. But the things that have been going on in the last 10 days will not be very easily reversed if they're reversible at all. So by the time people see,
it's too late.
Oh,
it might be a bit
it
late.
really might be too late. And so, you know, I think they've started to figure this out, but the idea of see rests on the power of contradiction. He said he was going to lower prices. He's going to raise. He is raising prices through his tariffs. He said he was going to just deport undocumented criminals. He's going after everybody. You know, and so let the contradiction speak to the people. But it doesn't work if there's a kind of shamelessness, nor if there's a kind of deep enjoyment of the cruelty with which things are going on.
And the shamelessness, of course, is part of the attraction.
Yes.
Honig, I'd like to thank you for a very delightful conversation. You told me before that if you would like the conversation, you're going to send me your Lars von Trier book. I will check my mailbox. I would like to thank the audience. The next conversation here is early summer with Adam Phillips, who wrote a book about Winnicott, psychoanalyst, Freud translator, very good author. Check the dates. Get home safely, and when you cover yourself under your blanket, think of your blanket as a public thing. Thank you. Be well.